Hi, my name is Doug Black. I'm managing editor of Enterprise Tech, and today I'm with Addison Snell, one of the leading HPC industry analysts. He's CEO of Intersect 360. And Addison, we were talking, generally speaking, what do you see as the major development or trend, maybe the top two trends that you're seeing at the show?
I don't know, Doug, if I could even narrow it down to top two at this point. I think there has been an overarching theme of a lot of AI, machine learning, analytics that's in this market, and that represents an important plus-up opportunity for the use of HPC technologies in ways that will influence the arc of our lives over the next few years. But it's also distinct from the traditional HPC market where the fundamental drivers remain strong into the future. You don't want to just go into AI and forget about quantum chromodynamics and molecular modeling and all this good science that HPC continues to drive. So that's an important theme. And on the technology side, I've been talking a lot about object storage. I've been talking a lot about middleware, and obviously there's been big acquisitions over the last year with Dell EMC and HPE and SGI and some of the ramifications of that. So there's actually, it hasn't been one big dominant theme, but there have been a lot of very interesting stories that are worthwhile to talk about.
Well, one thing we've talked about is there seems to be just sort of a rising tide of alternative architectures that a lot of different vendors and organizations are talking about. And it almost seems as though, even though x86 is still highly dominant, there's just this ongoing movement that could change that landscape to some degree.
Right, and that's been evolving over the last couple of years, and is certainly gaining steam with the proliferation of a diversity of processing architecture paradigms, even within x86, to look at both multi-core and many-core x86 with the Xeon and Xeon Phi, and that's before you get into GPUs and APUs and power and FPGAs and DSPs and ARM. And all of these things are here at the show, and they all have a reasonable play in the HPC market, and that's challenging for end users, because we've really gone from originally an era when high-performance computers were relatively self-contained devices in SMPs or vectors, but they were architecturally diverse. And then the Beowulf clusters came, and we had technological disaggregation. They weren't self-contained anymore, but they were architecturally similar to one another. So you had MPI portability from one cluster to the next. Now we're kind of going to the Wild West, of the worst of both worlds, where you're keeping things technologically disaggregated and returning to an era of architectural specialization. That puts a lot of pressure on the application programmers and system administrators in terms of how to achieve application scalability. It's one of the reasons we talk about middleware a lot, software a lot. This is going to be one of the primary challenges on the routes to Exascale.
Well, about Exascale, are you impressed with the national effort to lead the U.S. toward Exascale levels of compute power?
I am, and part of that is implicit in the fact that we changed the terminology to a certain extent from exaflop to exascale. There's some fundamental acknowledgement there that if you post a raw exaflop but you don't have an application that runs there, are you willing to say that might be an exaflop, but we're not really at exascale yet? And I think a lot of the US effort, we could get to an exaflop faster, but there's some thoughtful development going on in terms of what does exascale truly mean in making this be something productive, and I am impressed in that level of investment. I think the thing that has the farthest to go is programming models. We can get there on hardware, but we have to be able to deliver that software ecosystem.
Yeah, it's getting around the perennial problem of systems that are out of balance, super on the processing, but the other aspects of the system.
Well, and that's been a trend that we've been seeing, and why we talk about things like object storage or burst buffers as a storage technology. We've been talking a lot about analytics and the role of AI. These aren't necessarily compute-centric messages, and we also get into things like in network computing or in storage, computing in storage. Those are also trends that we've seen out there. From a technology perspective, there haven't been a lot of new platforms or things at the show, but Mellanox with the push to 200 gigabit and also continuing things like in-network computing, probably the most significant individual product announcement associated with this show.
Yeah, do they call that smart networking or?
SMART is the acronym they have that has to do with the in-network computing capabilities for their range of products, yes.
Another major trend is the democratization of HPC as it becomes increasingly adopted in the enterprise and commercial settings.
Right.
Are you seeing any significant moves or trends around the democratization idea?
I think that's been happening. I think that's continuing. I think that's, again, been a perennial theme that we keep coming back to. It was a big deal when I started in this industry in the late 90s with SGI. We founded Intersect 360 Research 10 years ago, and we were talking about it then, and it's still an issue now. And it's not that it hasn't been happening. All through this time, there have been more and more companies adopting HPC. It's a question of what does success look like? We keep widening that aperture a little bit. We have been successful. The business computing areas of HPC have been the fastest growing. They're continuing to be faster growing than the public sector. It doesn't all happen overnight. Relative to what's going on at this show, we do keep talking about cloud and what its role is in HPC. Microsoft Azure has made a big push in terms of really bringing up the profile of Azure there. Now we still have Amazon Web Services has probably been the leader here, and we've had Google in there all along, but Azure, I think, is maybe in the most improved category here from last year to this year in terms of how much energy we're seeing around their ability to do HPC in the Microsoft cloud.
Right. Is there anything in particular that they've done, or is it just a general sense?
They have. They've had a couple of recent announcements having to do with populating HPC instances, including GPU computing. They've had some announcements concerning the ability to do AI in the Microsoft cloud. The ability to do AI there, it does have a great deal of cloud affinity, has I think been pushing more of these high performance instances in the cloud. But the real genesis of this goes back to a year ago when they really shifted the strategy on Azure in order to be inclusive of what's the role of Linux as a back end in the Microsoft Azure cloud. That was a fundamental change that they made that really enabled them to start growing in this space more quickly.
Yeah. So the other big topic of conversation, we've heard it all around, is people talking about the implications of Donald Trump being elected and the impact that could have on the HPC industry. Do you have any thoughts in that regard?
You know, it's something that a lot of us have been thinking about, both personally and professionally. And with Donald Trump coming into the White House, it does bear a lot of thought in terms of, at a policy level, how that could influence the high-performance computing and supercomputing markets. Now, he's not in office yet. He's still defining a lot of his policies, but if we start to reflect on things that he said over time, we can make some early hypotheses that on the general scientific research side, there might be some things where we see areas of disinvestment. He doesn't want bigger government in some of those spaces, certainly in some areas like climate modeling. I think, you know, that's an area that's going to come under attack in the new administration. He wants to see less investment in that and redirect those dollars elsewhere. And if you reduce general government research, that can have a deleterious effect on the academic market to the extent that they're tied to grants through things like NIH and NSF. If those get lessened, then you get less academic research. Conversely, I think there's a question up in the air as to what we'll see in defense spending. That defense and intelligence could actually go on a slight upswing. And a lot of the commercial markets could actually benefit from Trump's policies depending on how he implements them. He certainly telegraphed that he has a great interest in increasing the national infrastructure. He wants to see more on energy. He wants to see more in manufacturing. And if he does a lot of deregulation as promised in finance and pharmaceuticals, that could actually have an increase in how much HPC spending we see in those major vertical markets. So I don't think it's negative across the board. My early hypothesis is just from an HPC perspective, you'll see a mixed bag where it'll be positive on some of the industry sides and negative on some of the general scientific research side.
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Addison. Appreciate appreciate your thoughts.
My pleasure, Doug. Thanks for having me in.
Thanks.